All right, let's jump right into one of the biggest questions in all of economics. I mean, this is a tension that really shapes our entire society. How do we get the absolute most out of our resources? But also, how do we share it all fairly? Yeah, we're talking about the big showdown, efficiency versus equity.
Okay, so picture this. It's a really simple problem on the surface. You've got one pizza, but you've got 8 hungry friends. Who gets a slice? Seriously, how do you decide? Do you give it to the friend who's obviously the hungriest? Or maybe the one who's willing to pay the most for it? Do you try to be super fair and cut it into 8 tiny, probably unsatisfying slivers? Or hey, what about just the first 4 people who showed up?
You see, how we answer that question, well, it reveals pretty much everything about how our economy works, and maybe more importantly, who it works for. Because let's be real, that pizza isn't just a pizza, right? It's a stand-in for all the scarce resources in our world. We're talking everything from food and housing to jobs and opportunities. And how we decide to slice that big economic pie, that's really at the heart of our biggest economic and social debates.
So, okay, one pizza, many mouths. How do we actually decide who gets what? It turns out societies have come up with a whole bunch of ways to solve this allocation problem. There's definitely not just one way to do it.
In fact, you can break it down into about 8 different methods. I mean, you could use a command system, right? The boss or the government just decides who gets the pizza. Or you could make it a contest. Hey, the fastest runner gets a slice. You could even do a lottery, leave it all up to pure chance. You could even use force, though that might end a few friendships pretty quickly. But the one method that really dominates our modern economy, the one we're going to zero in on, is the market price.
All right, so let's talk about the market's answer, this invisible hands recipe. How exactly does the market decide who gets the pizza? Well, the whole answer really boils down to 2 super powerful but pretty simple concepts: consumer surplus and producer surplus. First up is consumer surplus. You know that awesome feeling you get when you find a total bargain? That's it. It's the difference between what you were willing to shell out for something and what you actually had to pay. It's basically like getting free value, pure extra cash in your pocket. So let's make this super concrete. Let's say you were totally willing to pay $2 for that slice of pizza. You're hungry, but the market price is only $1. The second you make that purchase, boom, you've just gained $1 of what we call consumer surplus. That's your good deal. Okay, so that's one side of the coin. On the other side of that same transaction, you've got producer surplus. This is the benefit the seller gets, right? It's the difference between the price they sold the item for and how much it actually cost them to produce it in the first place. So let's say it cost the pizzeria $10 for all the ingredients, the labor, the oven's electricity, everything, to make that whole pizza. If they sell it for $15, they've just earned $5 of producer surplus. And that's not just profit. That's the very incentive that makes them want to keep making more pizzas for all of us. Okay, so we have buyers looking for a deal and sellers looking for a profit. Now here's where the real magic happens. When you put all these buyers and sellers together into a competitive market, something truly remarkable starts to occur. The system, like all by itself, starts working to maximize the total value for everyone involved. This is that famous invisible hand that Adam Smith talked about way back in 1776. His whole point was that when individuals are just acting in their own self-interest, you trying to get a good deal, the pizzeria trying to make a profit, they can unintentionally end up creating a benefit for society as a whole. And this all leads us to that sweet spot where supply meets demand, what economists call equilibrium. At this one specific point, the total surplus, that's consumer surplus plus producer surplus, is maximized. It's at its absolute peak. And that is the very definition of an efficient outcome. The economic pie is officially as big as it can possibly get. No resources are wasted, no value is left on the table. But hold on. If the market is so perfect at making the biggest possible pie, why are we always arguing about the economy? Well, it's because that perfect system isn't always so perfect. There are definitely cracks in it. And this really brings up 2 huge critical questions. First, is the biggest possible pie always a fairly sliced pie? And second, what happens when that whole system breaks down, when the market just stops working the way it's supposed to? Well, when the market ends up producing either too much of something or too little, we call that a market failure. And the result is something economists call dead weight loss. The best way to think about it is value that just vanishes. It's like a slice of the pie that disappears into thin air before anyone can eat it.
It's a loss of surplus that nobody gets to enjoy, not the buyer, not the seller. The economic pie literally gets smaller. And, market failure can happen for a ton of reasons. Things like price and quantity regulations, taxes and subsidies, those pesky side effects like pollution, what economists call externalities, or things like monopolies, or even just when it's really costly to make a deal. All of these things can jam up the gears and get in the way of that perfectly efficient outcome.
So let's shift gears. Even if the market was perfectly efficient, we're still left with that other, much tougher question. Is it fair? And before we can even begin to answer that, we have to ask ourselves, what do we even mean by fair?
Well, it turns out there are basically two completely different ways to think about this. On one side, you've got people who say, it's not fair if the result isn't fair. They're looking at the final score, the outcomes. They see some people with huge slices of pie and others with just crumbs, and they say, nope, that's not fair. But on the other side, you have people who say, it's not fair if the rules aren't fair. They're focused on the process. For them, as long as the rules of the game are the same for everyone, no cheating, no stealing, just people making voluntary choices, then whatever outcome happens is, by definition, fair.
And this fundamental clash, this tension between fair results and fair rules, this leads us straight to the central dilemma in pretty much all of economic policy. It's a concept so important, economists just call it the big trade-off. So that fair results idea comes from a philosophy called utilitarianism, basically trying to get the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The logic goes like this. A single dollar gives way more benefit, more happiness, to a poor person than it does to a rich person, right? So the conclusion seems simple. If you want to maximize total happiness in society, you should just keep transferring income from the rich to the poor until everyone is equal.
I mean, that sounds pretty compelling, doesn't it? So why don't we just do that? Why not just make everyone's income completely and totally equal?
Well, here it is. It's because of the big trade-off. The problem is that the very act of trying to reslice the economic pie can actually cause the whole pie to shrink. Think about it. If you tax income to redistribute it, that might make people work and save less. It could reduce the incentive to take risks and innovate, and that can lead to less overall economic production, which means there's a smaller pie for everyone.
Let's make this real with a tough case study. How do you allocate bottled water after a disaster? If you just let the market price do its thing, it's efficient. The water goes to whoever values it most, whoever's willing to pay. The fair rules view would say, hey, that's fair, it's voluntary. But the fair results view would say, that's totally unfair, because the poorest people could literally go thirsty. And if you try other methods like government command or a lottery, well, they're usually less efficient, and you can argue they're unfair from both perspectives. As you can see, there are just no easy choices here.
So when efficiency and fairness collide, which one do you prioritize? There really is no easy answer. And that's the ultimate showdown, isn't it? When making the economic pie as big as possible conflicts with slicing it up fairly, what do we do? Do we go for efficiency or do we go for equity? This isn't just some abstract question for economists in a classroom. It's a question for all of us, in our societies every single day. And finding that right balance, well, that's the hardest part.